Roosevelt, I would like to start with you. You're a senior lecturer at Columbia's Center for American Studies. And from 2008 to 2018, you served as the director of Columbia's core curriculum. And you're also the director of Columbia's Freedom and Citizenship program, in addition to the recent author of this fantastic book, Rescuing Socrates, How the Great Books Changed My Life and Why They Matter for a New Generation. I want to start with the title of the book as a way to think about your argument. So in the book, Socrates, not only, the name Rescuing Socrates, not only represents kind of the classic texts, as you say, the great books of the Western canon, but also more broadly, a liberal education itself. And the question follows, of course, from what or from whom are you rescuing this liberal education? We might pose some answers. Are you rescuing it from the model of the research university, from the steep decline of bachelor degrees in English, philosophy, religion, foreign languages? Are you rescuing it from accusations that the Western canon has been used to cover imperialist, racist agendas to justify the subjugation and exploitation of non-Western people? And you can add your own, of course, understandings of a liberal arts education as a frivolous distraction from more useful or pre-professional educations. So as we get started here, Roosevelt, putting aside the kind of rhetoric that often accompanies this discussion, what is actually the biggest and most serious threat to what Socrates represents in your book?
That's quite a question. Thank you, Alice. And just let me say before attempting to say something about the question, just how happy I am to be here and to thank you for inviting me, and how honored I am to be sharing this conversation with Andrew Delbanco, who has been a formative and seminal thinker in my life in so many ways. So this is just really wonderful to be able to have this conversation with both of you. You're right in reading Rescuing Socrates as making an allusion to the imperiled state of liberal education in the academy. And many of the things you say are the forces that create what I argue in the book is an essentially inhospitable environment to the practice of liberal education within the academy. There are, of course, forces outside of the academy that work against the practice of liberal education. In the United States, the kind of increasing view of college in transactional terms as an institution where young people go, invest a lot of time and money, and think of it as an investment that's supposed to pay off in the form of some kind of advantage in the labor market. That narrative of college as job preparation is the culturally dominant framework. So that puts a lot of pressure on the practice of liberal education, but there are a lot of pressures inside the university, and this book is mainly concerned with those. One of those pressures that I pay a lot of attention to in the book is the fact that the modern university, is dominated by disciplinary categories, departments, and budget lines, faculty lines, careers are organized around these disciplinary pigeonholes. Liberal education is, by definition, non-disciplinary. It is an education in the broadest, generalist questions that concern us as human beings, and rooted in this condition of freedom that characterizes the human state. Even the liberal arts disciplines, as they are practiced in the university, are largely non-liberal in the sense that they have a professionalizing thrust. So many of the liberal arts majors in the universities, in English and art history and philosophy, the majors are organized as preparation for further specialized study in graduate school, even though most students who say major in English don't want to go and get a PhD in English. But that's the logic of the major is professionalizing, which is non-liberal. So there is, in most places, no curricular home for true liberal education, for a kind of education that aims at introducing students to the skills, but also the content that best equips them for a responsible life of citizenship and for a life that maximizes the possibilities for freedom. A liberal education is an education that is appropriate for a free individual, but so much of our education is to turn people into laborers or specialists in one side, in one way or another. Then there are kind of ideological and epistemological tensions in the university, some of which you mentioned as well, the historical association with kind of the classics and liberal education and great books with colonialist and imperialist projects, even deeper epistemological challenges to some of the basic notions that underlie liberal education, such as human freedom. So all of these forces together make, I think, the institutional environment of higher education an inhospitable place to the actual practice of liberal education.
And let's just be clear here, because Columbia College is, apart from St. John's, Columbia College is the only university in America now that requires all incoming students to take, as you say, liberal arts education. So there are other universities, Yale, Stanford, Chicago, that offer kind of selective cores, but Columbia is really alone in this offering.
Columbia is certainly alone in its peer group, in the R1 universities. There are some smaller universities and certainly some colleges that have required common grade books oriented programs. Columbia does stand alone in the kind of highly selective R1 universities, research universities. It stands alone in requiring a common foundational text liberal education program for all of its undergraduates.
Okay, fantastic. Andy, I want to turn to you. You're the Professor of American Studies at Columbia. You're the author of 9 books. You're a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a member of the American Philosophical Association, and you're the president of the Teagle Foundation. I want to think about the Teagle Foundation as we continue to talk about the liberal arts here. There are kind of 2, it seems to me, explicit goals of the Teagle Foundation. One, that liberal arts education is part of the promise of democracy and thus must not be restricted to the privileged few, and that liberal arts education must further not be restricted to students within, as Roosevelt was pointing out, certain areas of study, academic interests, or majors, as they're often called. Why does the Teagle Foundation believe this? Because in your view, it helps individuals develop critical thinking skills, which makes them better able to evaluate claims and ideas on the basis of evidence. It helps them communicate with clarity and civility, both verbally and through the written word. You go on to say that a liberal arts education fosters humility, curiosity, empathy, and concern for others. In fact, you would go so far as to say that it is fundamental to meaningful work, effective citizenship, and a fulfilling life. Taking probably the boldest claim out of all these claims, what is the relationship, Andy, between traditional liberal arts education and a healthy, functioning democracy?
Well, thank you, Alice, for the invitation. Let me just say in a preliminary way, it's great to see you. We knew each other only glancingly when you were at Columbia, but it's nice to see you again, even over Zoom. And as for those nice things that Roosevelt said about me, the problem with that is that if I don't say something worthwhile in the next hour, it's going to make both of us look bad. So I hope it won't be a complete waste of time in terms of what I have to say. Now, that was a pretty big mouthful that you just dished out. And I recognize most of that language, except for the phrase critical thinking, which is something I've sworn never to write myself, because I don't understand the difference between critical thinking and thinking. But it probably comes from some other place on the Teagle website that maybe I didn't clean up once I got there. But yes, to be more serious, we believe at the foundation, and I suspect most of the folks on this Zoom tonight believe that one of the key elements in a functioning democracy is an educated citizenry, if not the foundational element. That statement goes back in our country, at least as far as Thomas Jefferson, who, of course, had a very narrow conception of who qualified as a citizen. Women didn't, Black people didn't, he didn't feel that immigrants should. But if we can extract those rather significant exemptions from the statement, I'm inclined to agree with it as a statement of principle. And fortunately, we have been able to widen the circle that includes people qualified for citizenship, though we have a long way to go. In any event, how can we expect citizens to evaluate, the difference between demagoguery and leadership, or the difference between lies and a good faith effort to tell the truth, or opinions versus arguments? How can we expect voters and people who choose to participate even more actively than voting in our democracy, how can we expect them to live up to the responsibilities of citizenship if they don't have some practice for those habits of mind? And I sentimentally perhaps believe that the college classroom, if it's taught well, and if the texts on the table are fruitful and challenging, is a pretty good place to develop the habits of citizenship. I think somewhere or other I wrote that I thought the college classroom can be and should be a rehearsal space for democracy. It's a place where students learn to disagree with each other in a civil way, and they learn the difference between argument and opinion. And most of all, they learn that it's possible to change one's mind. It's actually possible to feel that something that you believed by hearsay or because somebody you liked or respected told you this was true, that it's possible that if that claim comes under pressure, you might want to reconsider it. So I think the college classroom is a pretty important place. And as Roosevelt said, and as he so powerfully objects to in his wonderful book, fewer and fewer college classrooms are places where that sort of thing is happening. And I don't want to make a long speech here because this is much better spent hour if it becomes a conversation rather than a couple of monologues. But I do want to say that while I think it's extremely important to note what is and isn't going on at the elite end of our higher education system or non-system, we ought to recognize that the vast majority of undergraduate students in the United States don't attend places like Columbia on the one hand, which has a compulsory core curriculum, or Brown University on the other, which has a total freedom of choice. Most American students, about 75% of them, attend public universities. Some, about 40%, or 7 or 8 million, attend two-year community colleges. And these institutions, are arguably more important for the future of our democracy than the kinds of places that we've been privileged to attend, particularly since the children of immigrants, students of color, students from low-income families, that's their portal of entry into American political society. So let's keep those institutions in view in this conversation, and the Teagle Foundation very much tries to do that.
Right. So this is to this point exactly, Andy. I want to ask you before turning back to Roosevelt, what concretely does the Teagle Foundation do to reach these, as you say, less privileged students who aren't necessarily interested or even ready to broach a liberal arts education?
Well, we try to do a lot of things, and we don't have very much money, so we can only do them up to a point. We're a small foundation, right? We're not in the universe of the Mellons and the Fords, which have many billions of dollars. We have somewhere between $100 and $200 million, depending on how the market is doing. Today, it's not doing very well. But we attempt to make interventions in all these areas. So for example, with community colleges, we believe that what we call our cornerstone program, which is an effort to revitalize general education and to bring students into contact with what sometimes get called transformative texts or classics or great books or significant or enduring books, you can pick whatever adjective you prefer. We believe that students in community colleges have just as much appetite to confront the issues that are raised by such books as students in the Ivy League, and in fact, in some cases more so. So just a couple of weeks ago, we had a workshop with 3 faculty members, one from Austin Community College in Texas, one from Onondaga Community College in upstate New York, and one from Lynn Benton Community College in the Northwest. And these faculty were fabulous. And the students they're teaching in a cornerstone classroom are tremendously responsive to the kind of education that Roosevelt celebrates and represents in his book. So you know, there's a hazard, there's a snobbery hazard. I'm not accusing anybody on this call of having that, but a lot of people feel like, oh, those people in community colleges, they're just there to learn a trade. They're just there to get a skill. And it's true, it's perfectly true that students from families who can't afford to pay much for college are very focused on the question of what kind of employment they will find at the other end of the college journey. That's perfectly true. But that does not mean that they are not also citizens. They're not also people. They're not also young folks with fundamental questions on their minds, and that they don't deserve the opportunity to discuss those questions with peers, right. Just like everybody else.
Right. As a way to respond to what you said and to transition back to Roosevelt, I wanted to read a quote that I first read in Contemporary Civilization with Roosevelt as my professor. This is from W.E.B. Du Bois, who wrote, I'm sure you both know this very well, the function of the university is not simply to teach breadwinning or to furnish teachers for the public schools or to be a center of polite society. It is above all to be the organ of that fine adjustment between real life and the growing knowledge of life, an adjustment which forms the secret of civilization. It's a lovely, it's a lovely quote. Roosevelt, I mentioned that the rhetoric surrounding these conversations can be quite strong and indeed incendiary. We were talking right before the call that the publication of your book sparked some particularly strong reactions, and I wanted to actually go to one of them to push your argument to be even stronger. I just wanted to hear your
Before you do that, can I make one quick comment on this question of democracy and making true liberal education accessible to the non-elites in society? Just want to kind of highlight and emphasize some of the things that Andy said. This morning, I was speaking to students and faculty at Ostos Community College. Ostos Community College is a community college in the South Bronx, in the poorest congressional district in America, with a high concentration of low-income, first-generation immigrant students of color. And those students are as hungry and as prepared to think deeply and grapple with these fundamental texts as any other students. And just in my experience, it's not true that the only thing that those students go to college for is to get skills for a job. In fact, it seems that we as a culture tell them that's the only thing that they should go to school for, but they get there and they want more. And whenever they have a shot, whenever they have a chance at tasting that, at experiencing that, they flock to it because they recognize the value of that, and they recognize that it is not an impoverishment of their kind of economic aspirations, but a way of enriching their capacity to reach them. And I want to point out just the obvious thing. It's not news to anybody that democracy, right? A word that means rule by the people, requires that a people have the necessary education to engage in self-governance. They're human questions, complicated questions, a kind of certain features of character that go into the kind of individual that can meaningfully participate in a collective project of self-governance. And that's what liberal education is about. And without liberal education, not for the elites, but for the people, for the demos, we cannot have a democracy.
And so you would argue that it's okay if students are going to school to learn a profession, that a liberal arts education is just simply an addition. You can have both.
Yes, yes. A liberal arts education, in fact, it is imperative that it would not be presented as an alternative to a useful or practical education, but as its foundation. This is and we do, low income students who don't have access to kind of cultural capital a tremendous disservice when we present liberal education as an alternative to an education that will get you a job. We must organize our curricula and our institutions such that students don't have to sacrifice their career aspirations in order to get a liberal education.
Yeah, it's a great point, and it just takes such a small move of fine-tuning, I think, quite subtle. So I want to make this very kind of provocative point that one of your critics makes, just to hear your response, Roosevelt, because I know that you can absolutely handle it. So at the end of his tirade against your book, and actually another book, he writes that a class in social psychology can be as revelatory and inspiring as a class on the novel. The idea that students develop a greater capacity for empathy by reading books and literature classes about people who never existed than they can by taking classes in fields that study actual human behavior does not make a lot of sense. In short, he writes, the humanities do not have a monopoly on moral insight. Do you agree? One. And what, if anything, do the humanities have a monopoly on?
Well, who could disagree with the statement that the humanities don't have a monopoly on anything? Of course, one cannot claim that the humanities will have a monopoly on anything except perhaps unemployability by PhD students. But no, speaking seriously, certainly the humanities as disciplines in the university don't have a monopoly on moral insight, but it is quite preposterous and astonishing from a literature professor to imagine that the study of fiction and the study of literature does not add something to our understanding, to our intuition, and to our to the depth of our humanity. I disagree very fundamentally with that critic. And would say that literature, and specifically the novel, is the most effective technology that we have developed for the task of understanding how somebody else experiences the world. There is nothing that we have produced that brings us closer to this fundamental experience of education, which has to do with our capacity to imagine what the world looks like from a different set of eyes. Social psychology and social sciences enrich our understanding in very profound ways, but there are things about the human experience that cannot be elucidated and that we cannot touch except by entering this imaginative world, guided by a writer, guided by somebody who does this well. In a novel, you spend hours looking at the world, experiencing social situations, reasoning through social situations from somebody else's point of view. And there is just nothing that educates your own perspective at that level, except that work of imagination. And it is one of the reasons why literature is worth reading for all of our students, and not just the social sciences to kind of understand human behavior.
Andy, I saw you with your head in your hands when I read the quote. What for you is particular or life-changing about the humanities?
Okay, I guess I'll avoid commenting on the words you read, and I'll try to make a positive rather than a negative statement. Look, fiction, as far as I can make out, at least fiction which finds an enduring audience and remains compelling for readers beyond the moment, is always about people in conflict with themselves. That's, I think, what drives the novel. Now, maybe that's a unwarranted general statement, and we have some literary folks on the call who will take umbrage at it, but that's my take. Young people are wrestling with questions like, what's the difference between desire and love? What's the difference between ambition and greed? How do I balance my responsibilities to myself and to others? Or should I care about that question? Or where do I turn for guidance if I feel like I don't have it right? Those are the kinds of questions that are at stake in literature, not just in fiction, but also maybe even more so in drama, maybe a little less so in lyric poetry, but not really. Lyric poetry is, in a way, the most intimate expression of such questions. The idea that it's not a valuable experience for young people to be able to, as we sometimes say, mediate their own concerns through works of literature, that we shouldn't be teaching literature, as was otherwise suggested in the article to which you alluded, as if it's some kind of a technical subject. You know, we should teach them about literary history, or we should teach them about structural questions or questions of influence, or, I mean, those things are all fine for people with a professional interest in literature, but why on earth would they be of any interest to undergraduates? And I think, frankly, that the fact that English professors have put the emphasis on those kinds of questions rather than on the sorts of issues I raised a moment ago is part, not all, but part of the explanation of why English departments have become lonely places with no students in them. So the kind of teaching and reading that Roosevelt talks about, which is best conducted, I think, in the structure of a general education curriculum. That is to say, a curriculum that's shared by all students, and that does not presuppose that you're going to go on and become an English major or a philosophy major or any of those less than useful fields. You may become an engineer, you may become a physician, you may become an investment banker, but you start out as a human being, and literature speaks to human questions. So that, to me, is the justification for trying to support efforts to bring literature to a broader cross-section of students. And I should, you know, I'm not here to make an advertisement for the Teagle Foundation, but this Cornerstone program that I referred to earlier, it entails not only the introductory Columbia core style first-year seminar class, which is a very important part of it, but also pathways through college whereby students who choose, let's say, technology or climate, environmental science, or neuroscience, or any of the rapidly growing fields that attract lots of students, where they can keep humanistic questions in view. I mean, students understand that technology, for instance, as it progresses more rapidly than any of us can grasp, creates as many problems as it solves. Like, who gets to control it? Where do we draw the line between privacy and marketing? These are values questions. These are humanistic questions, and students need to be equipped to think about them regardless of what they end up doing professionally. So the humanities should not be just a sort of one-off when you're a first-year student. They should permeate the curriculum, but that doesn't mean more English majors. It means giving them a place of dignity in the college curriculum more generally.
Before we turn back to Roosevelt, I just want to, because in his book, Rescuing Socrates, he highlights 4 major thinkers that have had a huge effect on him, first as a student and now as a teacher: Plato, Augustine, Gandhi, and Freud. For you, who were the transformative encounters as an undergraduate or as a teacher?
Is that question addressed to me? Sorry, I lost it.
Yeah.
Oh, so I'm supposed to, gee, well, I mean, clearly because you won't be surprised since I spent 20 years thinking, teaching, and then finally writing about him. The writer who really knocked me for a loop and shook me in many ways was Herman Melville. By the way, when I taught in the Literature Humanities course in the Columbia Core, it was a great advantage for my work on Melville because I suddenly realized I was reading the books that he had read. And you know, I read epic. I mean, Moby Dick is a kind of epic, so you read Odyssey, Iliad, and Aeneid, and you have a little bit better sense of what he was up to. And there's Dante is all over his work. Goethe is all over his work. So one reason, this is a digression and a non-answer to your question, but one reason for students who are interested in contemporary writing, and contemporary writing, of course, encompasses a much wider range of voices than the historical canon does. If you want to read works by writers of color and works by women and works by writers who acknowledge that their sexual preferences are not those that were historically prescribed by society, you're going to be reading more contemporary writers than older writers. But those contemporary writers have read the older writers. I mean, Du Bois was very big on that point. So Melville was a big deal for me. It was also a revelation. That's an accidentally, perhaps well-chosen word, I don't know, for me as a secular Jewish person to encounter the evangelical Protestant tradition that is so important in the development of American culture, most conspicuously represented by figures like Jonathan Edwards, who raised very significant questions about human nature and the capacity for what he called sin, a concept that goes in and out of fashion, but arose again seriously in the wake of the events of the 1930s and 1940s. So reading in that tradition, not so much in college as early in graduate school, was a revelatory experience for me. But also, you know, just kind of the recreational reading that I did around the edges of my courses. I remember reading Graham Greene one day for 5 or 6 hours consecutively, which is not something I can do very much anymore, in my dorm room, and being blown away by his book, The Power and the Glory. So my influences are a little less well-defined, I guess, than Roosevelt's. And on a given day of the week, I would answer this question in a different way, but that's at least the beginning of an answer.
Roosevelt, would you like to add anything to anything that Andy said?
Well, I guess hearing Andy talk, one thing that it highlights for me is the ways in which these experiences were expanded. That is, expanded with Andy's view of the world, not because they echoed what he already knew, but because they presented him with something quite outside his sphere. I think sometimes we have a tendency to think that the works that will be meaningful to people are the ones that resonate with their own experience, the ones that kind of mirror back to them things that are familiar, perhaps by deepening or defamiliarizing them for them. And of course, that does happen. But as was the case for me, and it's I hear it in Andy's description, these works that connected with me just on a much more fundamental level than, you know, my particular culture, let's say, or my experience as an immigrant. These works that I discuss in the book, and some of the most important works that have influenced me, did so by illuminating my own humanity at this very, very deep level, you know, at the level like, what do I have in common with Socrates, or with St. Augustine, or with Plato, with Gandhi, with Freud? Very little that can be easily kind of pinned to my culture, my experiences. but there is something about our shared humanity that I connect with them over. So that strikes me, that literature and education is a way to expand, literally to expand your sense of what humanity is. So that the most influential things can often be so, because they're so alien, so far away, and yet are comprehensible and compelling to you.
Yeah.
Could I say two quick things about that? Just
Yeah.
one really quick thing. I had occasion last week, also in the context of a Teagle program, to hear a conversation between two wonderful poets, Rachel Haddis and Major Jackson. And at one point in that discussion, I think I said it, or but they seemed to think it was right. There are no trespassing signs for writers. That is, poets are interested in all other poems. The poets I know, certainly those two wonderful poets, they don't care about the color of the poet or even the original language of the poet, if there's a good translation available, or the historical moment of the poet, or the politics of the poet. They care about the poem, and the poem gets into their own nervous system in a way, and then gets processed and is present somehow in their own work. So one of the things that it's helpful for students to see is that the world of literature and the creation of art more generally is a world of radical freedom, in which identity, as we usually think of it, is not constraining in the ways that we often want to think it is. But I want to say one other quick thing, and I'll try not to be long-winded. We've been talking, and I think this is a good conversation, we've been talking mainly thematically. What are the issues that are raised by literature or political philosophy, as we find in, say, the CC course in the core? How do we build citizens? And I mean, I believe that's all very important. Otherwise, I wouldn't have said some of the things that I said. But I think we don't want to lose the opportunity to acknowledge that one of the things that this kind of educational experience gives to students is pleasure. That is, you asked me about writers that matter to me, and I said Melville. I didn't really say why. Well, the real reason why Melville grabbed me is I could not believe the stuff that he could do with words. Just mundane experiences that we might all have. He finds ways to articulate them with surprising combinations of words that just open up your vision in a way that would not have happened otherwise. I mean, I don't have my text in front of me, but I mean, his description of Queequeg in Moby Dick, remember Ishmael's bedmate, he calls him George Washington cannibalistically developed. Now, there's so much going on in that phrase. It's funny, it's serious, it's irreverent, it's vivid. It makes you start to think, what does it mean? We think of cannibalism as something primitive, but here he says he's developed, and then the father of our country. What's going on here? It just grabs your attention in a way that the ordinary language does not. Or when Ahab makes his first appearance in Moby Dick, we've been hearing about him for 16 or 17 chapters, but nobody has seen him. And he finally stands there on the quarterdeck, and Melville says of him, reality outran apprehension. I mean, what an incredibly economical way of saying, everything that we imagine doesn't live up to the thing itself. So I just want to say, students, and we're talking about literature, the same thing is emphatically true for the art humanities class, maybe even more so, and the music humanities class that are part of the Columbia core. These are intensely pleasurable experiences if students can open themselves to them. And that's part of what we owe to students, and not just in the fancy places.
Okay, fantastic. I have two things to add. First, I want to go back to what Roosevelt said to cite something that you wrote, Roosevelt, in your book, just to really make the point very clear, because I think it's really well written. You write, representation of cultural backgrounds of a diverse student body as an organizing principle in general education necessarily leads to incoherence, essentialism, and tokenism. the criterion of democratic representation, which is appropriate for politics, is not appropriate for selecting common curricula. To adopt it as such is to abandon the very idea of education and to turn students into interest groups, each lobbying for their own special curricular accommodations. So very, very good. And if that isn't a taste test for why people should get your book, I don't know what is. To this point of a pleasure that Andy was making, this actually comes back to a question that I had for both of you, because Andy, you also wrote a book about 10 years ago now called College, What It Was, What It Is, and What It Should Be. And it struck me, well, first I'd love to hear what you would add now, having 10 years later. But, and I think maybe I'm having this thought more that I'm now in France, where, you know, France is less of a capitalist society than America is, and pleasure for pleasure's sake, or anything for anything's sake, outside of the kind of framework of late capitalism, or outside of the intellectual framework of neoliberalism, is much more the case. I notice it here than I did in America. And so how do you, both of you, grapple with incoming students who have spent 18 years of their lives within this capitalist system that's gearing them up to get into college? They turn them, we were joking about this also before the call, they turn themselves into this kind of perfect package. They talk about their life goals. They can tell you all about their career plans. And then they have this brief moment, 3 years, 4 years, or even 2 years in the case of a community college, before they have to then go out into this capitalist world again that's beckoning them, starting their junior year of college, let's say. How do you break them out of this framework so briefly? And is it increasingly more difficult, as I would argue capitalism is only becoming more rampant in America today?
If I could begin with some thoughts, I think you put your finger on something quite important, and sometimes I marvel at the oddness of this position that you have as a core teacher at Columbia. So, you know, when Andy goes into the Lit Hum classroom to teach Plato and Dante and Homer and Montaigne, quite far from his training as an Americanist. When I go into the CC classroom, which is where I met you, to read Marx and Rousseau and Smith and Burke, again, quite far from my academic specialty, we go into that classroom to do this kind of countercultural in so many dimensions, practice this countercultural in so many dimensions. Sometimes I note that Columbia students who, by the time they get into Columbia, have become kind of professional students, have crafted their resumes, their educational experiences, their personal experience at such a kind of high caliber. And part of what we do in the core is to, I think as you alluded, kind of try to unwind some of this, try to sow some skepticism about the ways that perhaps many of them have organized their pursuits and the way that they have been thinking about their lives. I know when I teach CC, and you might remember, is there are texts that come towards the end of the semester, like Du Bois or like Virginia Woolf's Three Guineas, that are quite extraordinarily critical of the educational enterprise, the institutional economic enterprise in which we're operating in the classroom, and sowing a little bit of skepticism, presenting a kind of an alternative set of values to the ones that dominate in the culture and that perhaps some of the students have internalized, seems to me like one of the primary functions of a liberal education, which of course at Columbia is done through the core, but education, this place of liberal education within the curriculum should act to some extent as a counterbalance, as a, probably antidote is too strong a way of putting it, but certainly it's something that pulls the student in a different direction, and that introduces a different kind of perspective, a different lens through which they can think about their own lives and about what matters to them. So, it's impossible that in one semester you're going to undo a whole lifetime of messages, but you can get quite far in reorienting students in how they might think of themselves. I've experienced it myself, but I've seen it so often that students walk out of their core experience really reoriented, really kind of awakened to a different way of thinking about what it is they want and what it is that it's worth pursuing for them.
Andy, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, there's so much to say, but the British philosopher Michael Oakeshott has a nice phrase called, he speaks of college as giving the gift of interval. And I think that captures, what Roosevelt was just saying. It is impossible to exaggerate how stressed young people are right now. And we should acknowledge that the stress has only been magnified by the pandemic, especially perhaps for students from less affluent backgrounds who were hit in various ways harder by and large, but for everybody. And this frantic rat race for positioning yourself in the line for reward in what you call our late capitalist society, that's certainly true. I'm not sure that young people are any more calm and relaxed in non-capitalist societies, if there are such things anymore. But let's just say in the contemporary world, though I take your point that the rhythm of things may be different in France than they are in the United States. We have to give these students a chance to pause for reflection and to make them feel like it's not a waste of time. And it's not going to penalize them as they head for whatever goal they think they want. And that's, that's such an important function of college. And it's one that I think most colleges are meeting with less and less success. So this is a very serious problem. And I don't have a one-size-fits-all solution to it, but we better attend to it. Otherwise, the casualty rate of student well-being is just going to keep on increasing, and it's already intolerably high.
Andy, like Roosevelt, have you seen students transformed, as it were, by encountering these texts, albeit briefly in a semester or 2 semesters?
Well, that's of course the most rewarding thing that a teacher can experience, and I will confess, it's hard to say this without sounding self-serving, but I just hit a significant birthday, and my family secretly organized for me a bunch of letters and notes from old friends, including students from 30 and 40 years ago. And there's nothing more satisfying. Well, maybe there's some things more satisfying, but it's high on the satisfaction list to get a note from somebody who took a class from you 30, 35 years ago and say, you know what, that made a difference for me. And I got a few of those notes, so that was quite wonderful, and it continues to happen. And I know for sure it happens in Roosevelt's classroom, and I expect it happened to you. Well, let's turn the question on you. You went to Columbia College, so you have to say something nice about it, since this is a quasi-Columbia event. What did you have a transformative experience as an undergraduate?
Yeah, of course. I remember.
You already got a name in my class, so you don't need to.
No, I mean, I was talking about this. I'm reading, as I said, also I'm reading Ulysses now for a podcast at Shakespeare and Company in Paris, and we're talking about, the time that you encounter these great books, capital G, capital B. There's so much gatekeeping around them. There's so much myth making around them, and then when you just get to the page, as you say, I mean, Moby Dick isn't on the syllabus, but it was such a revelation to see it on the page. Same with Ulysses. I mean, there is nobody more irreverent and having fun with words than James Joyce in Ulysses. He's attacking everyone. He's attacking Shakespeare, he's attacking Plato, he's attacking Aristotle. And by the way, I wouldn't understand half of what he's saying if I hadn't read the core. And I still have to read all of the footnotes to inform the particularities of his attack on the canon. So yes, I mean, specifically, I remember having very uncomfortable conversations with my mother after reading Rousseau's Second Discourse on Inequality. I remember emailing Roosevelt after reading On the Passing of My Firstborn from Du Bois. And yeah, I mean, just many, and wanting to go back and do it again, frankly. Okay, so I want to turn to the chat because people have posed questions. Hilary would like to know, we're speaking mostly about literature here and a bit of philosophy, but she writes, for me, other disciplines of humanities are history, geography, and languages, not just literature. I suppose her question is, how expansive is your definition of humanities here? How far does it go?
Can I take a quick stab at that? And it gives me an opportunity to say, the best book, in my view, at least in my knowledge, ever written about general education, or which is really, in his use of it, a synonym for liberal education, is by Daniel Bell, who taught at Columbia at the time and wrote a book about called The Reforming of General Education. And in that book, he says, the fundamental requirement to be an educated person is the development of historical consciousness. That is to say, the awareness that the world has not always been the way it is now, and the inclination to think about what are the forces that go into making change. So I believe that quite deeply, and my own work sort of straddles somewhere on the line between literature and history. One of the great values, I think, of the way the core is organized is that it's organized historically. So you can see ideas emerging from older ideas, writers arguing with their predecessors, variations on ancient ideas cropping up again later on, and you get a sense of the world in flux and the world as a dynamic place that is susceptible to change, in part through the influence of ideas. So history belongs very close to the center of any humanistic educational program, in my opinion.
Yeah, my definition or my thinking about the humanities and the liberal arts, I tend to think of liberal arts because it's a broader term than the humanities. You can pursue any area of knowledge liberally. Liberal arts encompasses even the kind of quantitative fields. But there is a difference between studying history liberally and studying history as a discipline. And the same happens for literature, right? Earlier on, I was kind of lamenting how in the major you study literature in a kind of professionalizing way, in a kind of specialist way, and the same that happens in history, sociology, or philosophy. And I think there is a distinction to be drawn, maybe not a hard kind of black and white distinction, but a distinction nonetheless between that kind of study of history and a liberal study of history. So in the core, for example, which is a non-disciplinary program, right? You're not taking a literature class, you're not taking a history class or a philosophy class, but you read historical texts. You read, foundational texts in history, Herodotus, the histories, Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War, and many other texts, that fit into the discipline of history. You read a lot of philosophy texts, you read literary texts, but you're not doing them as disciplinary endeavors, but rather as liberal endeavors. You're reading them for the way in which they enrich your humanity and the way in which they empower you to live out this fully human life. So it's quite expensive. A few weeks ago, I had this really amazing experience. I was at St. John's College, which you brought up, and I went to a math class at St. John's College. And what they were doing in that math class, they were reading an excerpt from Descartes' treatise on geometry, which very few people read, and it was fascinating because Descartes, he does math with lines, he does mathematics without numbers. And if you read that text carefully, kind of just pour it over it, it opens up what mathematics is, what numbers are, what equations are, in an entirely different way than I had ever I have only studied mathematics in kind of traditional ways. Or you read Leibniz treatise on the calculus, and there it's not like you're just learning. It's not like you're learning calculus from Leibniz. You're learning how one comes up with calculus. What are the problems that Leibniz is encountering that lead him to thinking mathematically in this other way to describe and probe these problems that he's encountering. So these are kind of liberal approaches to even these quantitative, most definingly quantitative field like mathematics. So my conception of liberal education is absolutely broad, but it's non-disciplinary.
Let's go to Fred's question, because it's great. He asks, how does one decide what is part of the core curriculum with the vast history of literature, not to mention other humanities? What criteria do you use to choose and define the texts? Given that
I ran the core curriculum for 10 years, so very much kind of in the belly of those debates. One thing is that by almost any definition you come up with, there are going to be way more texts than you can possibly deal with in a course or even in the course of an undergraduate education. So you're always going to have to make value judgments based on some usually practical, intuitive, pragmatic criteria rather than some ideological definition of what the essence of a great book is. One thing that we value at Columbia is kind of this historical depth, so we choose a chronological approach. We say in the course of a semester or in the course of a year, we're going to go back to the earliest texts in the case of the text-based courses, and then move chronologically here. How many can we fit over the course of 2 semesters that are foundational, that are important, that are manageable in a classroom? You can't do Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit in a week in the core classroom, but maybe you can do Hegel's Introduction to the Philosophy of History. You can't do Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, but maybe you can do Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals. So there are kind of some pragmatic things that come into the decision. If you're teaching, I'd say, at a historically Black college or university, you're going to have a different criterion for selection from the literary past than if you are at a traditional liberal arts college, for example. If you're at a university in India or in China, you might have a different approach to what the literary philosophical past looks like. So there aren't any hard and fast criteria to choose, but certainly you can be guided by certain values. And I spent a lot of time in discussions at Columbia and elsewhere about the kinds of values that can inform curricular formation. But even getting there, even getting to faculty deciding to make a selection that expresses a consensus about what matters in a core curriculum, that's a place that most schools don't even get to. Everybody's just allowed to go and do their own thing and make their own selections.
Andy, how do you decide for the Teagle Foundation? And this will have to be, unfortunately, be the last question, because
we don't decide for our grantees what books they should teach. We have to get into dialogue with them. I would say, my best answer to this question, there's a line in a lovely book by Frank Kermode called The Classic, in which he tries to define the classic. And I like the way it is. He says, a classic is a book that's read a long time after it was written. And you know what? The number of books on that list is actually rather short.
Right.
Which means these are books that seem somehow to remain fresh and mean something different to each generation. And from that relatively short list of books, you pick your own list and you run with it, and it'll be fine.